Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. Beneath the silence of old America, there are stories we were never meant to hear, stories not written in school books, not spoken around dinner tables, but whispered only in the dark corners of forgotten towns. This is one of those stories. A girl, just a child, was forced to carry the child of her own father. It sounds impossible, unbearable, something we instinctively want to turn away from. But history has no mercy, and neither does blood. What you're about to hear is not myth or exaggeration. It is the grim truth of a woman whose very existence became the most inbred life ever recorded. She carried within her womb the cruel weight of her father's sin, and in doing so, became a ghost of America's most forbidden past. It begins in the shadowed mountains, where isolation was both survival and curse. Families lived in tight clusters, their lives wrapped in secrecy, their kin tangled closer than the land itself. And in one of these hidden places, there was a father who looked at his daughter not as blood, but as possession. He blurred the sacred line between parent and child, and in that twisted act, he planted something that would grow into both flesh and shame. Imagine being too young to even understand what love meant, yet carrying the child of the man meant to protect you. Imagine the silence, the way the walls seemed to close in tighter with every month her belly grew. Neighbors suspected, but no one spoke. In those parts of the country, silence was survival, and secrets stayed buried until the ground itself decided to split open. Her eyes told the story long before her lips did. The hollow stare, the trembling hands, the way she walked with a heaviness far beyond her years. The day she gave birth, it wasn't a celebration. It was an unholy echo, a doubling of sin. A daughter who became a mother, a grandfather who was also a father, a child born into a web of shame, his very first breath already tangled in the sins of generations. This is not just her story. It is the story of how family lines collapse under the crushing weight of inbreeding, of what happens when blood turns against itself. Tonight, we will trace the life of the most inbred woman in history, and what it means when survival turns into horror, and when love turns into something unspeakable. She never had a choice. From the moment she was old enough to understand fear, her life belonged to someone else. Her father's shadow followed her everywhere, and in that house, every locked door meant nothing. For her, childhood ended before it began. The cradle was replaced by a bed of shame, and every whisper in the night was a warning that there was no escape. In towns like hers, women didn't speak about such things. They hid them like broken bones beneath layers of silence, because to admit the truth meant tearing the fabric of family apart. Her pregnancy was a spectacle wrapped in secrecy. People saw, they always did. The way her body changed, the way her eyes hollowed deeper, as if she was already disappearing into herself. Yet no one asked questions they didn't want the answers to. Rural America was built on unspoken agreements. Don't ask, don't interfere, don't disrupt the illusion of order. So the neighbors looked away, and the church bowed its head in selective blindness. The shame wasn't hers alone. It was a community's burden, and they buried it alive in silence. When the baby came, it was as though the air in that house grew heavier. She was only a girl, yet the weight of motherhood crushed her into something fragile and old. The child bore the unmistakable marks of blood turned against blood. Eyes too close together, jawline underformed, skin pale as if it carried the sickness of secrecy itself. To the father, it was proof of power. To the girl, it was proof of damnation. What makes this story different, what makes it echo across time, is not just that she gave birth to her father's child, it's that the cycle didn't end there. With each generation, the blood grew weaker, the bodies more fragile, the minds more clouded. She wasn't just a victim of one man, she was a link in a chain, bound by rusted iron, forged by the sins of her ancestors. And once she, became a mother she knew. Her life was no longer her own. Every breath she took was for a child who should never have existed, a child who would carry her scars deeper into the future. History doesn't preserve her name. She is faceless, nameless, buried under shame. But the tragedy of her bloodline lingers like smoke in an abandoned house. And when we dig deep enough, when we dare to lift the stones America has tried to forget, we find her story waiting to remind us that not all monsters live outside the family. Some sit at the dinner table. The deeper we dig into her life, the clearer it becomes that she was born into a trap, a cycle set long before her first cry. Generations before her had already blurred the lines of kinship. Cousins married cousins, uncles claimed nieces, brothers lay beside sisters in the secrecy of wooden cabins where the law never reached. It wasn't spoken of as horror, but as necessity. In lands where families were cut off from the world, where roads washed out and outsiders were feared, blood was the only resource they trusted. What began as survival became ritual, and by the time she was born, the web of inbreeding was so thick that no one in her family could untangle it. She was not the first, nor would she be the last, to bear the unbearable, but hers was the story that seemed to carry the curse most vividly, as if fate itself had chosen her as a warning. She carried not just her father's child, but the evidence of centuries of isolation, decay, and silence. Her body told the truth even when her lips could not. Sunken eyes, frail bones, teeth too small for her mouth. She looked older than she was, as though time itself had devoured her youth before she could live it. The birth marked her as something less than human in the eyes of those who whispered about her. Women who had once braided her hair now avoided her gaze. Men who had once tipped their hats to her now muttered behind closed doors. She became an unspoken ghost while still alive, trapped in the same town that had watched her suffer and done nothing to stop it. They didn't pity her, they feared her, because in her child's face they saw the reflection of what happens when secrets rot too long in silence. And yet, she endured. Day after day, she carried the baby against her chest, rocking it in the dark while her father's footsteps creaked across the floorboards. The child cried with a sound that unsettled even the hardest hearts, thin and uneven, as if its lungs were too weak for this world. Still, she mothered it with the gentleness she herself had been denied. That contradiction, the purity of her love born from the vilest of sins, is what makes her story so haunting. She was both victim and mother, trapped between the horror of what was done to her and the innocence of what she now held. Her silence was her survival, but silence has a way of echoing louder than screams when the truth is unbearable. And the truth of her bloodline would not stay hidden forever. By the time her child began to walk, the world already treated them as an abomination. The boy was not seen as innocent, but as evidence. His very existence was proof of the father's crime, of the family's sickness, of the town's silent complicity. Children whispered behind their hands, pointing at his uneven face, the way he limped when he tried to run, the way his words came out broken, as though his tongue could not keep up with his mind. Mothers pulled their children away from him, as if he carried a curse that might spread by touch alone. For her, every day was a reminder of the betrayal written into her body, and now etched onto her sons. She could not escape it, no matter how tightly she tried to wrap him in her arms, no matter how softly she sang to him when the nights grew too long. His father, her father, remained in the house, a shadow that never left, proud in his silence, unrepentant in his gaze. To him, the child was not a sin but a possession, the living mark of his power. And in that twisted pride he began to hint that it would not stop there. The cycle, he believed, would continue as it always had, through her and the child she bore. Generations of inbreeding do more than weaken the body. They weaken the spirit, the will to fight, the belief that life could be different. And so, she lived like a ghost within her own skin, too young to leave, too tied to blood to escape. Each day felt like another shovel of dirt covering her alive, as though she were being buried in the very soil of her family's sins. But history, even when buried, has a way of seeping out. Rumors spread further than the mountains. A doctor in a neighboring county whispered about the deformities, about the child that should not exist. A preacher muttered of demons walking in flesh. Outsiders began to hear, and with them came questions the town had never wanted to answer. What had been ban and hidden for years was now cracking open, threatening to expose not only one man's crime, but a whole community's silence. And here lies the quiet horror. She was not seen as the victim, but as the shame. The blame did not fall on the man who took her childhood, but on the girl who carried his proof into the world. She was made to wear the weight of his sin like a scar across her face, a mark that no one could unsee. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? As the years passed, her world narrowed into a prison of repetition. The child she bore grew, but never in the way children should. His bones were fragile, his mind clouded, his body marked by the weakness of too many generations folded in on themselves. She watched him struggle to walk, struggle to speak, struggle to fit into a world that had already decided he was cursed. And each time he failed, the blame was silently placed on her. To the eyes around her, she wasn't a mother trying to raise a broken child. She was the origin of the brokenness itself. The father's hold only deepened. He saw himself as untouchable, the patriarch of a bloodline no one dared challenge. To him, her body was soil, and he would plant his seed again and again, no matter how many times it rotted. She lived in constant fear, waiting for the nights when his footsteps stopped outside her door, the air thick with the weight of inevitability. Each breath she took felt stolen, as if her life belonged to him, parceled out in moments between his demands. What makes her story so unbearable is not just the horror of what he did, but the silence of everyone who knew. Relatives who turned away, neighbors who muttered but never acted, preachers who spoke of sin on Sunday morning but never once named the sin rotting in the house at the edge of town. In that silence, she became less than human. She was no longer daughter, no longer mother, no longer child. She was a vessel, a body through which sin was recycled and made flesh again. And yet, she endured. That endurance was its own kind of defiance. Every time she rocked her child to sleep, every time she whispered comfort to him when the world spit him out, she proved that even in the deepest pit of inbreeding and cruelty, there was still a trace of humanity fighting to survive. It was faint, like a candle nearly smothered by smoke, but it was there. He carried her pain quietly, and with each passing year, the lines on her face etched a history no one wanted to read. But history doesn't erase itself, it waits. And in the cracks of that silence, her story began to seep outward, one whisper at a time, until it reached beyond the valley and forced the world to look into the shadows it had long ignored. The whispers became harder to silence. By then, the boy was old enough to walk among others, and his presence alone was enough to spread the truth like wildfire. His face bore the unmistakable marks of a lineage too tangled to deny. Strangers who passed through the town carried tales with them, stories of a child who looked like no child should, stories of a girl who had become a mother to her own father's son. These stories traveled faster than the family could bury them, and soon, outsiders began to arrive with questions too sharp to ignore. Doctors came first, their curiosity disguised as charity. They wanted to examine the boy, to measure his bones, to test the limits of his mind. To them, he was less than human. He was evidence, a living specimen of what happens when blood is forced to fold in on itself too many times. They scribbled notes, made quiet remarks, and left with their heads shaking. But they never spoke of her suffering. They never saw her as anything more than the mother of a phenomenon. Then came the preachers, drawn by rumor of a place cursed by sin. They spoke in trembling voices about God's wrath, about bloodlines twisted by evil, about the wages of sin being paid in flesh. But when they left, nothing changed. No hand reached out to free her. No voice demanded justice for the girl who had been stolen by her own blood. She remained where she had always been, alone in the shadow of a man who refused to release her. The townspeople began to splinter. Some wanted the truth buried deeper, fearing shame more than justice. Others, braver or more guilty, began to murmur that something had to be done. But still, no one acted. And so the girl continued to carry the unbearable weight, raising her child under the eyes of a world that saw him as both victim and monster, a mirror of everything they wished to deny. Her story is more than just a single tragedy. It is a reflection of what happens when silence is chosen over truth, when blood ties become shackles, when the sins of one man poison the roots of generations. She lived her life as both witness and prisoner, carrying a child who should never have been conceived, yet loving him with the only love she had left to give. That is what makes her story unforgettable. It is horror tangled with tenderness, cruelty braided with resilience. And still, the cycle loomed. Her father's shadow had not lifted. It waited, patient, for another night, another act, another child. The horror was not over. It was only deepening. There comes a point in every buried story when the silence can no longer hold. For her, that moment came quietly, without fanfare, like a crack forming in the foundation of a house. The boy was growing, but with growth came sickness, seizures that shook his body, fevers that burned him to the edge of death. Each time he fell ill, the community could no longer look away. His existence was a living indictment, and every cough, every limp, every vacant stare screamed the truth they had all tried to smother. The child was proof, and proof cannot be hidden forever. She herself was a shadow of what she might have been, too young to be called a woman, yet too scarred to be called a girl. Her body bore the toll of childbirth, her face carved into premature age by fear and sleepless nights. And still, her father lingered, always watching, always claiming what he believed was his. She must have known deep in her bones that the cycle was waiting to repeat, that another pregnancy would only deepen the nightmare. Yet escape was not a word she had ever been allowed to learn. The whispers turned to rumors, the rumors to stories, and the stories to warnings. Outsiders began to speak of her as if she were a cautionary tale, a living lesson in what happens when blood corrupts itself. Her name, if it was ever spoken, became less important than what she represented, the most inbred woman in history. Not a human being with dreams, fears, and pain, but a symbol of everything America wanted to keep buried. She was no longer just herself. She was history's scar. And here is where the horror settles deepest. Her story was never hers alone to tell. It was stolen, rewritten by others, carried like a rumor across generations. We do not know her words because no one ever asked. We only know the fragments, the child born of her father, the deformities etched into flesh, the silence that suffocated her life. She is both unforgettable and unknown, remembered not for who she was, but for what was done to her. In the end, the ground kept her secret, but time did not. Her story slipped through the cracks, carried in whispers, in warnings, in half-forgotten tales told to remind us that the darkest horrors are not found in myths or monsters, but in families, in houses like ours, in the people sworn to protect us. She carried her father's child, and in doing so carried the unbearable weight of history itself. That is why her story lives on, not because it is comfortable, but because it is too disturbing to ever truly forget. Would you like me to now craft a chilling outro that closes the video with the same haunting weight, leaving viewers unsettled long after it ends?